let us explain. Both employer and employee can contribute to the 401k plan. The U.S. government allows the employee to deduct the amount of her contribution from her taxable earnings, up to a maximum contribution which was $17,500 in 2013 and 2014, or $23,000 if you're over age 50. This tax advantage is the main reason that financial advisors, and virtually all the advice you'll hear, recommend that before you make any other investment, you should contribute as much as possible to your 401k, the maximum. The employee contribution, the employer often provides a matching contribution. Usually, if the employee contributes nothing, the employer contributes nothing either. But if the employee contributes $1,000, the employer will match that by contributing a percentage of it to the employee's plan also. The website 401khelpcenter.com says that 27% of employers match employees' contributions dollar for dollar up to a specified percentage of the employee's pay, usually 6%, and 23% of employers match employees' contributions 50 cents on the dollar up to a percentage of pay. So, if you have a 401k plan and your salary is $50,000 and your employer matches your contribution up to 6% of pay, then the maximum the employer will contribute in a year is 6% of $50,000 or $3,000. If your employer matches you dollar for dollar, then if you contribute $3,000, your employer will contribute $3,000. If your employer matches you 50 cents on the dollar, then you need to contribute $6,000 for your employer to contribute $3,000. If your salary is $100,000, your employer will match your contribution up to $6,000 instead of $3,000. Yes, you should probably contribute to your 401k at least up to the point where your employer contributes the maximum. You could still go wrong with that, but it's a good rule. But should you contribute more than that, up to the maximum that's tax deductible? 99+% of advisors will say, of course you should, it's tax deductible. What could possibly be wrong with that advice? You need to ask, okay, I get a great tax benefit if I contribute to my 401k to the max, but am I giving anything up? Yes, you could be giving up a lot. You're giving up fees to the plan's provider and its investment managers. Some 401k plan providers don't charge too much. If your plan has one of those, then you should contribute to the max. But if the provider is not low cost, you could be getting ripped off. And it could be for more than you gain from tax deferral. Unfortunately, you may have a very hard time with some plans finding out how much you're paying. Nobody seems to ask this important question, so even the employee benefits administrator at your company may not know. If you try but just can't find out the total fees you're paying, it's a red flag. It means the plan provider doesn't want to answer. It's 99% certain that the fees are too high. If this happens, don't contribute any more than the amount required to get the maximum employer match. It may sound crazy, but if you can save more than enough to get the employer match, just pay the tax on the rest. Then skip the 401k and invest it in the lowest cost, best diversified, or lowest risk investment available, a total stock market ETF or TIPS, or a combination of the two, as noted in rule number 2. You'll be better off. How much of a fee makes it not worth it to contribute? Suppose you actually are able to find out what your total 401k fees are. If you are able to find out, how high can they be before you'll be better off not to contribute? Suppose you're thinking of contributing $10,000 to your 401k plan and your tax rate is 20%, but it will be lower after retirement, 15%. Suppose you will withdraw your money in 30 years and your investments will earn 5% until then, of which 2.5% is dividends and income. If the fees in your 401k are 1.5%, you will earn 3.5% a year after fees. The 5% return less 1.5% fees. If you don't contribute the $10,000 to your 401k but take it in salary instead, you'll have to pay $2,000 tax. That leaves you with only $8,000 to invest. But now you can invest it in low-cost index ETFs with fees of only about 0.2% or less because you don't have to pay the 401k fees. Then here's the answer. Invested in your 401k, you will have $23,858 in 30 years. If you pay the tax and then invest outside your 401k, you will have $27,933 in 30 years. Hence, you'll have $4,075, or 16% more, if you don't put the money in the 401k than if you do. You can do the calculation yourself if you're adept with spreadsheet arithmetic. You should get a similar result. Our spreadsheet is available at the 3 Rules of Investing website. Like all such calculations, the results depend on the numbers you put into them, the assumptions. It depends on the tax rates, fees, future return, and the portion of it that is income. But given the assumptions we've made in our example, we can calculate that the 401k fees would have to come down from 1.5% to 0.95% before it's worth it for you to contribute to it. According to the Society for Human Resource Management, SHRM, the average total plan cost for small 401k plans was 1.46% in 2012. Of this, the average expense ratio of the investment vehicles offered by the plans was a high 1.37%. Note that this does not include transaction costs in the funds, mostly brokerage commissions, which could be as much as an additional 0.5% if turnover is high. Hence, in small plans, it will usually not make sense to contribute more than your employer matches. Even in large plans, SHRM says the average cost is 1.03%. So for about half of those, it will not make sense to contribute the maximum, but only what your employer will match. SHRM gave only the average costs. In each plan, there may be a low-cost investment alternative. If there is a fund with much lower costs, it may make sense to invest in your 401k. But the advice that you should always contribute as much as you can to your 401k is simply wrong. The off-kilter advice to rebalance regularly. Now let's take up the myth of rebalancing. Everybody, but everybody, says you must rebalance your portfolio. The funny thing is, nobody ever really explains why. In a way, the rebalancing myth is the illegitimate daughter of asset allocation. Asset allocation is something your advisor does when you start out. Let's keep asset allocation simple. Suppose you start with an allocation of 60% to stocks and 40% to bonds. Your portfolio is $100,000, so you put $60,000 in stocks and $40,000 in bonds. A year passes. It's a good year for stocks. At the end of it, you have $75,000 in stocks and $42,000 in bonds. Your portfolio is now 64.1% stocks and 35.9% bonds. Should you do anything? Oddly, the financial experts who put so much effort into trying to make the Markowitz optimizer work for asset allocation, and then just fudged the whole thing in the end by plugging in whatever numbers made it work, as we discovered in Deadly Temptation number 3, seem not to have thought about that. They didn't address at the same time what you would do next, say a year later. They were too busy optimizing, or trying to. So what did they do when it dawned on them that you have to decide again later what your asset allocation should be? They just assumed it should be the same as the first time you ran the algorithm. In other words, they decided you needed to rebalance to the original allocation. Hence, if your portfolio changes over the year so that it has 64.1% in stocks and 35.9% in bonds, when your original allocation was 60% in stocks and 40% in bonds, that means you need to sell some stocks and buy some bonds to get back to the 60-40 mix. But why? Curiously, this question is never answered. All the academic literature about rebalancing simply assumes you should rebalance. It never, ever explains why. For example, here is a quote from an article titled Rebalancing in the Journal of Portfolio Management. In general, investors have a target asset allocation that they seek to maintain. When a portfolio's actual allocation deviates from its target allocation, the result will be tracking error compared to the target allocation. The key benefit of rebalancing is to reduce this tracking error. The tracking error referred to is the error of departing from the 60-40 mix, or whatever allocation was originally decided on. But the article doesn't explain why allowing the portfolio to depart over time from that mix is an error, or what benefit reducing this error provides. In fact, it doesn't even make an effort to explain it. It just declares it. Yet the article is titled Rebalancing. You'd think it would say something about why you would do it in the first place. When academicians, for example, are asked to explain what objective is served by rebalancing, they'll usually say it's to keep your risk under control, to keep it constant. But it doesn't keep risk under control. In fact, it can destroy your control over that risk. How rebalancing can destroy your control over your investment risk. Here's an example. One way to control risk is to put a portion of your portfolio into something very safe. Let's suppose, for example, that you've just retired and you've done pretty well in your saving and investing. You have $1 million. Here is how you perceive risk. Let's say that on top of your Social Security payments, you feel you must have a bare minimum of $20,000 in income a year, and you must leave at least $500,000 to your children in 30 years. You refuse to take any risk that might endanger those bare minimum requirements. Fortunately, you don't have to. When you retire, lo and behold, there are 30-year U.S. Treasury bonds available that pay 4% interest. If you buy $500,000 of those, they'll pay you $20,000 a year in interest, and you'll get your $500,000 back in 30 years to leave to your children. These Treasury bonds completely eliminate the risk, except the risk that the U.S. government won't make good on its guarantee, which you consider negligible. And only half your money, $500,000 out of your $1 million, is needed to secure your minimum requirements. You can invest the other half in something more risky. Therefore, your strategy is to purchase $500,000 worth of U.S. Treasury bonds and take some risk with the other $500,000 by putting it in stocks. Your portfolio now consists of 50% stocks and 50% Treasury bonds. The first year, the stock market has a bad year and loses 20%. Your stock portfolio goes down in value to $400,000. Meanwhile, you collect the $20,000 interest payment on the bonds, and they're still worth $500,000. Now your total portfolio is worth only $900,000. Fortunately, though, you still have the guarantee of at least $20,000 in interest income a year from the bonds and a $500,000 principal payment at the end. Those bonds serve as security against risk, cushioning you against the severe ups and downs that can take place in the stock market. But your advisor, if you have one, tells you that you must rebalance. Now your stock portfolio is only 44.4% stocks and 55.6% bonds. So you must sell some bonds in order to buy some stocks and restore the 50-50 mix. Perhaps he says you must do this to keep your risk level constant. The thing is, it won't keep your risk level constant. It will increase your risk. In fact, it will destroy your carefully laid risk avoidance strategy. You will have less Treasury bonds than you bought, so you will no longer be assured $20,000 annual income or a $500,000 principal payment when the bonds mature. You will be more exposed to stock market risk than you were, and more than you wanted to be. Not only that, but if the stock market goes up substantially, you will do much worse with the rebalancing strategy than by holding the treasuries and the stocks without rebalancing. That's because you will have more stocks on average if you don't rebalance than if you do. The problem is that the sophisticated algorithms of modern portfolio theory don't think beyond the immediate short-term time period. Hence, they define risk only as how much your portfolio could lose, or could fluctuate, in the very short term. This is like thinking of the risk of flying in a plane as if the risk were only how much the plane might vibrate in turbulence, instead of how likely it is to crash. Will rebalancing increase your return on investment? Some illustrations suggest you'll increase your return on investment by rebalancing. This can happen, of course, over certain time periods. But over other time periods, most in fact, it won't. There's no mathematical or theoretical reason that rebalancing should increase your return in the long run or lower your risk. It's strange that theorists who otherwise expend enormous amounts of effort proving in mathematical detail certain precepts of MPT expend no effort on advancing a theoretical reason for rebalancing. Rebalancing is merely an ad hoc device to connect other shaky parts of the MPT structure. The fact that the whole structure is so shaky doesn't seem to be noticed by either the theorists or the practitioners. Everybody agrees that the structure is sophisticated. So that's what it is. In fact, history shows that rebalancing would have performed worse over long time periods than the obvious alternative, buy and hold. Rebalancing would have performed poorly compared with not rebalancing. In other words, doing nothing. For example, if a portfolio started out with 50% stocks and 50% bonds, in each of the 58 30-year periods from 1926 to 2012, a rebalancing strategy would have beaten buy and hold in less than 12% of the 30-year periods, and for only 2 of those 58 30-year periods, 3% of them, by more than 0.2%. The buy and hold strategy would have beaten rebalancing by an average of 0.8% per year. For more information, see the 3 Rules of Investing website. The reason is that over long time periods, stocks have tended almost always to outperform bonds. That means that if you don't rebalance, stocks will gradually become a larger percentage of the portfolio than bonds. But since stocks perform better in the long run, your portfolio will do better if more of it is in stocks. Hence, not rebalancing will outperform rebalancing. The point is easily shown to have been true historically. See the 3 Rules of Investing website for details. What about performance on a risk-adjusted basis? That's more difficult to measure. However, the theoretical result, that is, the result derived from MPT itself, would be that risk-adjusted performance will be the same, whether you rebalance or not. But if you don't rebalance, doesn't that mean you'll wind up taking more risk than you intended to? From the example we gave earlier, the answer is obviously not. You should employ a reasoned through long-run risk avoidance strategy, not the ad hoc strategy of rebalancing. There's nothing wrong with rebalancing per se. It's one strategy you could use. It's good to have some kind of discipline, and rebalancing could be a candidate. Of course, there's something seriously wrong with rebalancing if it conflicts with another, perfectly good discipline that you've chosen, like the one in our example. What's wrong is to believe there's some reason you must do it. It's okay to do it if you think you need to impose a discipline on yourself, so you won't do stupid things on the spur of the moment, like putting all your money in a stock your gut tells you is going to take off. What's really, really wrong is to believe that investment professionals possess some sophisticated set of knowledge that explains why they know that you must always rebalance. If you make that mistake, you'll pay them for what you think they know, and lose a gigantic chunk of your money on their fees. What dollar cost averaging can and can't do. Dollar cost averaging is a myth that's usually harmless. In fact, it can be beneficial because it imposes a good discipline on a person with an intention to save regularly. It may even be an essential discipline for a struggling investor. But it's another example of a strategy that people think can do something for their investments that it can't do. So let's explain why dollar cost averaging won't do what many people think it can do. We'll use a column that one of the most insightful economists in the world, John Kay, wrote about it as our starting point. A regular columnist for the Financial Times, Professor K stated the argument for dollar cost averaging as follows. We have changed his pounds to dollars for the U.S. reader. Also, in Britain, shares means shares of stock. Here is a scheme for beating the market that really works. Imagine a volatile share that sells for 50 cents in odd years and $1 in even years. If you invest $100 every year in this share, over a 10-year period, you will have accumulated 1,500 shares at an average price of 66.7 cents, well below the average market price, which is 75 cents. In odd years, you get 200 shares for your $100, while in even years, you get 100 shares for your $100, which comes to 66.7 cents a share on average. It does sound like it beats the market. You buy shares at an average price of 66.7 cents, but the average market price is 75 cents. You're buying at a discount on average, or so it seems. But does it really beat the market? No. It's kind of an optical illusion. It's easy to check. Let's try it for only 2 years. Look at Figure 7. You invest $100 at the beginning of year 1 when the price is 50 cents, because year 1 is an odd year, which then doubles to $200 by year 2 because the price doubles to $1. Then you invest another $100, so you've got $300, which gets cut in half by the end of year 2, so you wind up with $150. What did the market do? The market started at 50, and at the end of the second year, it went back to 50 again, so the market was flat. No, you didn't beat the market. You invested $200, but you wound up with $150. You lost 25% of your investment, while the market lost nothing. But what if we flip-flopped and let the price be $1 in odd years and 50 cents in even years? Then you start with $100, which halves to $50. You invest another $100, so you've got $150, which doubles to $300. This time, you beat the market. So whether or not you beat the market depends on which year you started. Not very conclusive, is it? This is no better than random. Half the time, dollar cost averaging beats the market, and half the time it doesn't. At least in John K's example. Does dollar cost averaging work? Financial advisors who advocate dollar cost averaging are really just recommending that their clients invest regularly. If their clients think this strategy will help them beat the market, well, so much the better. The added incentive might help them maintain the discipline. We've seen in one example that dollar cost averaging sometimes works, beats the market, and sometimes doesn't. It depended on where the market started. It showed at least that it doesn't always work, but does it usually work? How often? To answer that question, we must first pose the obvious additional question, compared to what? Dollar cost averaging is the best plan if you have no alternative. That is, if the only way you can invest is by setting aside a regular amount out of your paycheck at regular intervals. But if you do have an alternative, what would it be? It must be that you have cash on hand that you could invest earlier than at those regular intervals. So let's compare dollar cost averaging with investing all at once, right at the outset. Let's assume the two alternatives are 1, taking a lump sum and investing it in stocks all at once, or 2, dividing it into equal pieces and investing it in the stock market at equal intervals, say monthly, over time. Which one is better? This is a comparison we can make. The historical advantage of lump sum investing over dollar cost averaging. We ran historical simulations for every monthly rolling 1-year, 3-year, and 5-year period during the 83 years from 1926 to 2008. In each case, we compared the rates of return on 1, investing a lump sum at the beginning of each period in the Standard & Poor's 500 index, and 2, dividing the lump sum into equal monthly amounts and investing it monthly over the period. The portion of the lump sum that is not invested in the stock market with dollar cost averaging is invested in 1-month U.S. Treasury bills while waiting to be invested in stocks. The results are shown in Table 4. This table shows that, on average, investing a lump sum all at once gave you a much better return than investing piecemeal with dollar cost averaging. Investing a lump sum, however, also gave you a higher variability, standard deviation of returns. They fluctuated more. You could interpret this higher variability, as MPT does, as higher risk. So as usual, a higher return is available only with higher risk. The historical study makes it clear that dollar cost averaging does not, by some miracle, transcend this risk-return relationship. The truth behind the golden rule. Gold is a hedge against inflation is right up there with the most frequently heard quotes on earth, like, better safe than sorry. But what does it mean? Presumably, it means that if the dollar, or some other major currency, gets so inflated in a few years that you can only buy half as much or a tenth as much in consumer goods, say food, with it, then gold will retain its value. You'll still be able to buy the same amount of consumer goods with gold. Well, it's plainly not true. First of all, you can't even buy food with gold. No one will sell it to you. You'll have to go exchange your gold for dollars first. So if the dollar gets so inflated that you can only buy half as much with it, does that mean that your gold will buy twice as many dollars as it did? It sounds right, but it doesn't work. Gold isn't used as a currency anymore, and probably never will be. There's no reason why it should retain any particular value in terms of a currency. It's free to float, just like a lot of other high-value items that have value because they're, say, nice to look at, or because speculators think they'll be worth even more later, like fine art. Such items have prices that fluctuate wildly and unpredictably. Their prices bear little or no relation to inflation, especially in the short run, and that short run can be quite long indeed. In an interesting and informative article, The Golden Dilemma, Claude B. Erb, a former investment management company executive, and Campbell R. Harvey, a professor of finance at Duke University, examined the argument that gold is a hedge against inflation. They found no support for that argument. On the contrary, gold ownership poses a much greater financial risk than inflation itself. Gold wasn't actively traded until 1975, after President Nixon took the United States off the gold standard. Erb and Harvey present evidence that shows that the price of gold in all major currencies has fluctuated from 1975 to 2012 much more than the currency's exchange rates. Hence, over that time, the only period of record with floating gold prices, holding gold subjected the owner to more risk than merely holding the wrong currency. Erb and Harvey explore whether gold can hedge against unexpected inflation by investigating whether gold price changes correlate with changes in inflation rates. If year-to-year gold price changes correlate with inflation rate changes, then gold could be used to hedge against unexpected inflation. But these researchers find no such correlation. Their conclusion is that gold does not hedge against unexpected inflation in the short run. In the longer run, 10-year periods, annualized gold returns have fluctuated much more widely than inflation rates. There has been substantial variation in 10-year annualized gold returns from as low as -6% per annum to as high as +20% per annum, Erb and Harvey write. Over the same time period, the low and high inflation returns were +2.3% per annum and +7.3% per annum. This suggests that gold is not a very effective long-term inflation hedge when the long term is defined as 10 years. Gold is a hedge against inflation is just another myth, nothing more. Summary of Deadly Temptation number 5. 1. If total fees in your 401k are more than 1%, it is better to invest only up to your employer's match, pay taxes on the rest, and invest it in low-cost funds outside the plan. 2. No theoretical or empirical reason or expert knowledge implies that it is right to rebalance your portfolio regularly. In some cases, It can even cause you to lose control of your risk. 3. Dollar cost averaging. While it can impose a useful discipline on an investor who needs to save regularly, provides no other investment benefit. 4. Gold is not an effective hedge against inflation. In fact, holding gold as an asset is much more risky than the risk of inflation itself. Deadly temptation number 6. Do what wealthy and sophisticated investors do. Wealthy and sophisticated investors actually get more wrong than ordinary investors. What they get wrong is that they think that because they're fielding a lot of money, they can buy the best expertise, and that, of course, will get them the best return. But in the investment management business, there's no relationship between what you pay for professional help and what you get in investment returns. We suspect it's going to be hard to convince you how wrong this idea is. Wealthy and sophisticated investors get wealthy somehow right? Presumably because they knew how to make money. So is it possible that they don't know how winds up getting intimately involved with his whole family? At one point, Dave, the rich man, played by Richard Dreyfuss, proudly but a little sheepishly, shows Jerry how he got rich. Coat hangers. Okay, someone has to make coat hangers. If you sell enough of them, you'll get rich. This was an ironic touch of realism in the film. It implied that many rich people get rich on what seems like a tiny little business niche. And in fact, it's true. Now let's take a real example. One of us, Michael, knew a man, we'll call him Bob, who retired with hundreds of millions of dollars. What did Bob make his money on? It seems that sheet metal is produced in humongous rolls to be used in automobile and truck assembly lines and other mammoth production processes. There are also businesses that need sheet metal for relatively smaller applications, though they still need a lot of it. The manufacturers of sheet metal in humongous rolls for automobile manufacturers don't want to bother dealing with those customers. Bob's business consisted of buying those humongous rolls of sheet metal, cutting them into smaller pieces, and selling the smaller but still huge pieces to customers who needed smaller quantities. On that business, Bob made hundreds of millions of dollars. Bob knew very, very well how to buy, cut up into smaller pieces, and resell sheet metal. Does that imply that Bob knew better than less wealthy people how to invest in, say, the stock market? No, not really. Unfortunately, his knowledge did put Bob in an even better position than less rich people to be taken for a ride by someone who does claim to know better than others how to invest, and who charges a substantial chunk of Bob's wealth for it. Bob, like many other people who acquire a deep expertise in a narrow field and make very good money at it, probably assumes that a professional in another field, who makes very good money at it, also has similarly deep practical expertise in that field. It seems like a reasonable assumption. Unfortunately, when it comes to the investment field, it's wrong. Almost no one, if anyone, is truly expert at investing in the stock market. The sea of hedge funds. Bob and other wealthy investors are targets for investments called hedge funds, of which there have been as many as 20,000, with thousands more hedge fund employees. Of those 20,000 hedge funds, less than half are still in operation now. Some of the 20,000 were the same person over and over again. Their hedge fund performed poorly and failed, so they closed it and started another. It wouldn't be so bad if hedge funds were only for people who can afford to lose the money, but increasingly these funds have also been sold to those who can't afford to lose it. Police, firefighters, and teachers, whose retirement savings are invested in public pension funds. It's one reason why some U.S. cities are in financial trouble, because their pension funds don't have enough money in them to make good on the retirement benefits they promised. Let's see how hedge funds have helped to do that to them, by first explaining what they are. Hedge fund is a term that does not describe the way a hedge fund invests, but has to do with their history. The origin of the modern hedge fund is often attributed to Alfred Winslow Jones, who founded a fund in 1949 that bought some stocks, called going long in them, while selling others, going short, thus creating a hedge against average stock market movements. If Jones were good at selecting stocks that would do better than the market average and buying them, and also good at identifying stocks that would do worse than the market average and selling them, then he would do well no matter whether the market average went up or down. This kind of strategy is now called long-short equities. Subsequently, the term hedge fund was applied to any investment fund using any strategy which was exempt from the rules that govern investments for the broad public, like mutual funds. The U.S. Securities Act of 1933 exempted funds that accepted investments only from accredited investors, who were defined as either individuals with net worth greater than $1 million or income exceeding $200,000, or institutional investors with investment assets in excess of $5 million. Hence, a hedge fund is any fund that does not market itself and accepts investments only from a small number of accredited investors. In 2000, when the broad stock market started falling, the total amount invested in hedge funds was only $200 billion, much less than 1% of all investments. But then hedge funds set about luring institutional investors like pension funds. By 2007, investments in hedge funds had increased more than tenfold, to $2.1 trillion. Simon Lack's revelation. Recently, a man named Simon Lack, who formerly worked for J.P. Morgan as a hedge fund seeder, that is, he selected nascent hedge funds to jumpstart by seeding them with J.P. Morgan money in exchange for a big percentage of the hedge fund's fees, wrote a book titled The Hedge Fund Mirage. In it, he describes how badly investors in hedge funds have done. In fact, his data showed that over the first decade of the 21st century, hedge fund investors lost money in hedge funds. Meanwhile, according to a study by the Financial Times, hedge fund investors paid 4.3% of their assets in fees to hedge fund managers and 3% to hedge fund brokers each year. From 2001 to 2010, that amounted to an average of $98 billion a year, more than 5 times the cost, in today's dollars, of the program that first put a man on the moon, the Apollo space program. In short, hedge fund investors pay gigantic fees to hedge fund managers and their brokers, making many of them billionaires, while the investors themselves not only didn't get rich, they actually lost money. Lack's revelation that hedge funds have done very poorly was so irrefutable that even the chief executive of the Hedge Fund Lobbying Organization, the Alternative Investment Management Association, AIMA, could come up with only a lame rebuttal, basically blaming the bad performance on investors for investing in hedge funds at the wrong times. Hedge fund performance measurement. You might have seen reports saying that hedge funds have performed very well, but they're wrong. Let's summarize some of the more blatant errors in hedge fund performance reporting. Studies of hedge fund performance have yielded wildly divergent results. Unfortunately, the financial media uncritically pass on to the public the simple averages of reported hedge fund performance spun out by database providers, without noting the deep flaws in those figures. First, hedge fund performance numbers are reported by hedge funds themselves to the database providers. They report their numbers only when and if they want to. It's obvious that they'll tend to report their performance only when it is good. So the reported figures will be, on average, much higher than the real ones. This is called self-selection bias. Hedge fund databases are so full of biases, errors, and trumped-up approximations that they're practically worthless. Among their biases that have been studied are survivorship bias. Funds that didn't survive, usually because of poor performance, aren't in the database. Backfill bias. Funds that have had above-average performance add their historical data to the database. That is, they backfill it, only after they decide that it was good enough. Selection bias. As mentioned, funds report only if they choose to. And back-end bias. Funds that crash and close in their final year don't report that year's data. As a result, reports of average hedge fund performance are worthless even though they are dutifully reported by publications otherwise as upright as The Economist and the Financial Times, without appropriate caveats, when passed on by database providers. Lack's other enlightening insights. Because of Simon Lack's once central position in the hedge fund industry, he is able to shed light on some interesting questions. There are too many to relay here, but we'll highlight one: the central position of large banks like J.P. Morgan and why they are able to make so much money. Lack's J.P. Morgan job was selecting promising hedge fund managers for J.P. Morgan to invest in. The process is called seeding a hedge fund. If a hedge fund manager wants to start a fund or accumulate more assets for a small fund that is already launched, the manager can go to J.P. Morgan and other big seed funders to try to get them to seed the fund with a substantial investment. In Lack's operation, seed funding was $25 million, which J.P. Morgan would invest to help a fund get started with a pool of assets. In return, J.P. Morgan would receive 25% of the fees charged by the fund. If the fund was successful, J.P. Morgan's share of the fees often dwarfed what it earned in returns on its $25 million seed investment. So J.P. Morgan didn't actually care very much if the fund got a good return on investment, as long as it could be sold to plenty of other investors. Meanwhile, a large bank that seeds a fund can introduce the fund to its clients and prospects, lending the fund an imprimatur that enables it to attract investors much better than it could without the backing of the bank's brand. As long as it abides by the legal restrictions on hedge fund marketing, a bank can leverage its brand to sell hedge funds that it has seeded to its clients, and then reap enormous fees in return. Few are aware that Harvard University's endowment fund, managed by Harvard Management Company, has also benefited from similar seed funding practices. It should be readily apparent what a conflict of interest this practice poses, as well as what enormous profits. So again, we see that investment professionals make their money chiefly on what are often slightly shadily procured fees paid by investors, not on their investment expertise. Hedge fund fees. Hedge funds are a bad deal because of their fees. Typically, a hedge fund charges a 2% administrative fee on assets invested, plus a performance fee of 20% of gains. Provisions vary, but usually the 20% on gains is not charged if the fund's price has not exceeded its last high water mark, the highest level it reached previously. Several problems arise with such asymmetric fees. Asymmetric because the manager charges you when the value of your investments goes up, but doesn't give anything back when it goes down. In fact, he keeps charging at least the administrative fee, which by itself is very high. The biggest problem, of course, is that you could wind up paying a lot for performance that isn't very good, because the fund's value could go up and down like the teeth of a saw. When it goes up, you'll pay the 2% administrative fee, plus 20% of what you gain. But when it goes down, you'll just lose and still pay the 2% administrative fee. So you pay a lot. But this fee structure provides an incentive to the fund manager to exaggerate the heights of the saw teeth. It incentivizes the manager to take risks, because the manager makes a lot of money from investors' performance fees when the risks pan out, but doesn't lose it back when they don't. Some hedge fund managers have substantial amounts of their own money invested in their funds, in which case they do have skin in the game. For example, it's possible, especially using derivatives like options, to construct a hedge fund investment strategy that posts nice gains in most years, say 4 out of 5 or 9 out of 10. But in the 5th or the 10th year, it loses it all back and more. Meanwhile, the manager, unless he really had a lot of his own money invested, has netted a tidy sum on fees. Not many hedge funds deliberately engage in this kind of strategy, but a lot of hedge fund strategies seem, after the fact, to have resembled it anyway. An awful lot of hedge funds did very well for a few years, then suddenly their performance was dreadful. For example, Long-Term Capital Management, the hedge fund that had 2 of the Nobel Prize winners who invented modern option theory and an ex-Federal Reserve governor working for it had returns in the 30% to 40% range for a few years in the 1990s. And then it lost almost everything it had in 1998. Investors who were in the fund during its good days did terribly overall, unless they were lucky enough to withdraw their money before it crashed. It was so bad, the fund had borrowed a lot of money from big banks, that the Federal Reserve worried, like it did in 2008, that the fund's failure would cause a domino effect and threaten the financial system. So the Fed arranged to have a meeting of the big banks that had loaned to the fund to get them to buy it out. An absurd variation. Funds of funds. Institutional investors and wealthy individual investors piled into hedge funds in the 2000s. A lot of them didn't really know much about this practice, but they had heard that the smart money was being invested in hedge funds. Also, a lot of these people and institutions had expensive consultants who had to make it appear to clients that they were doing something special for the money they were being paid. The consultants get invited by hedge fund managers to posh conferences in garden spots like Monaco. Michael wrote in The Big Investment Lie about a posh hedge fund conference he attended, gratis, in Geneva, Switzerland. Not only do they get to be wined and dined in a luxurious location, but they also get infused with sophisticated-sounding jargon that they can spout to their clients, enhancing their apparent value. What can these consultants recommend to their clients? If they recommend one hedge fund, it might go sour. Better not to take that chance. Also, there's the diversification thing that we talked about in Deadly Temptation number 5. So they might recommend a fund of funds, a kind of mutual fund of hedge funds. It combines several hedge funds in one investment vehicle. Of course, the funds of funds have to charge a fee. We're already in the stratosphere as far as fees go, so it's a little more stratospheric. Funds of funds fees make it, frankly, almost impossible to make any money in hedge funds for the investor. Of course, for the hedge fund and fund of funds providers, the whole setup is a wonderful blessing, remuneratively speaking. These people are not necessarily consciously corrupted, though surprisingly often they are. They may be just sifting through numbers, doing analyses, trying to find a hedge fund manager or an investment strategy that works. And some hedge fund managers are actually onto something from time to time. The now famous hedge fund manager, John Paulson, and his deputy, Paolo Pellegrini, correctly assessed the overvaluation of mortgage funds in 2006 and 2007, and made the greatest trade ever by betting against them, earning several $billion. But after that, Paulson's next bet went sour, and the fund lost half its value. If, impressed by his 2007 trades, you had put your money in his fund, you'd have lost half of it. Sometimes even the investor is corrupted. Well, not exactly the investor. In the case of pension funds, it is the fund administrator. The administrator doesn't actually have money on the line. She's just the agent. If the administrator runs, say, a public pension fund, the real investors are the taxpayers and the pensioners. The administrator also gets wined and dined by the hedge fund coterie. They imbue her with lingo that makes the administrator sound sophisticated to her bosses and her constituency. Who could argue with that? She gets sucked in. Then, if you know the real situation and you try to tell it to the actual investors, it's almost impossible to convince them what a bad deal they're getting. It's hard for them to believe that all those sophisticated whiners, diners, and jargon speakers are putting such a colossal one over on them. The odd thing is, it's right there on the bottom line, as Simon Lack showed. Their investment performance has been terrible, and still people can't believe it. All this said, some hedge funds do perform very well occasionally, as do some mutual funds, and even some novice home traders. But we've seen that the performance may be merely due to chance and may not last. Goldman's Global Alpha Hedge Fund did very well for a while, too, luring new investors. But we'll see in Deadly Temptation number 7 what happened. Help wanted. Managing pension, endowment, or foundation funds. Suppose you were suddenly put in charge of the teacher's pension fund in your city. You discover it has $2 or $3 billion in it. What would you do? Probably you would panic. You would think, I've got to get help. No one wants to be held responsible in a situation like that. If the market drops more than 40%, as it did in 2008, the fund might lose $1 billion. Do you want to risk being blamed for that? But if you hire a consulting firm that tells you to do what most other consulting firms would tell you to do, and it loses $1 billion, at least you can say, well, it's what the consultants advised, and they're an established and well-regarded firm and everybody else did it too. Now suppose you run a firm that consults on the investment of pension funds. What are you going to do? Will you recommend to your clients a course of action that's completely different from what other pension consulting firms recommend? No, you could get unlucky, and that course of action might cause your clients to do worse than anybody else. If your advice isn't much different from the advice that competing consulting firms give, your business will survive. So, after a while, everybody does the same thing. Whatever has evolved becomes standard practice, even if it makes no sense. That's what has happened. Investment consulting to large institutional investors has become a Rube Goldberg machine, going through a whole series of ridiculous contortions to arrive at a simple end result, but for high fees, of course. Rube Goldberg, 1883 to 1970, was a cartoonist who drew incredibly complicated machines that did something very simple, like light a match. The standard method of consulting to institutional investors. The method that investment consultants use with institutional investors, such as pension funds, resembles not so much a scientifically derived procedure, but a set of practices of a cult religion that the cult's adherents assume must have some reason for them, but nobody knows or remembers what the reasons are. Here's roughly how it works in a typical case. The consultant, after meeting with fund administrators to determine the fund's needs, runs a mathematically optimized asset allocation to come up with a recommended division of the fund among several asset groups. Keeping it simple for now, let's suppose these asset groups include some bonds and some stocks. The stocks are typically divided into about 4 or 5 equity-style categories, such as large growth stocks, small value stocks, and so forth. We've already examined in Deadly Temptation number 3 what running an asset allocation model using investment styles means. It means rigging it with inputs that will make it produce acceptable outputs. Once the recommended portfolio has been divided into style categories, the process begins of selecting an investment manager for each style. The consultant supplies several potential managers for each style. Each of them is sent a lengthy questionnaire about their investment performance, their employees, how long each has been with the firm, any legal scrapes the firm has gotten into, and on and on. After these questionnaires are returned, the field of possible managers for each style category is narrowed down to about 3. The remaining candidates are asked in for an interview, a major event for investment management firms because they stand to make a lot of money if they win. With the help of the investment consulting firm, the fund selects an investment manager for each style category. Then, as each investment manager proceeds to invest its portion of the funds over the next year or 2 or 3, the consultants help monitor its performance to see whether it is experiencing style drift. A manager's portfolio exhibits style drift if it starts to look different from the style the manager was supposed to manage. Suppose, for example, the manager was hired to manage a large value portfolio. The portfolio exhibits style drift if its periodic returns have a high tracking error, as compared with returns on a large value equity index. It's a no-no for investment managers to exhibit style drift. If they do, then the firm's managers are called on the carpet by the pension fund administrator and the consultant to explain why. What's wrong with all this? In the investment field, the right way is the simple way. The portfolio exhibits style drift if its periodic returns have a high tracking error, as compared with returns on a large value equity index. It's a no-no for investment managers to exhibit style drift. If they do, then the firm's managers are called on the carpet by the pension fund administrator and the consultant to explain why. What's wrong with all this? In the investment field, the right way is the simple way. Deadly temptation number 7. Use modern scientific financial theory. This is often the deadliest of temptations, and one of the most brazen. Science encompasses an array of serious, well-developed fields, such as physics, chemistry, and biology. Modern finance bears no resemblance to any of them. To apply the term science to the field of modern finance is to taint all sciences. Both science and engineering use mathematics in practical and sound ways. The mathematics used in these fields is both much more sophisticated and more practical than the mathematics used in the investment field. Let's explore some of the ways investment products and services sold by Wall Street and the financial industry use, or pretend to use, mathematics and modern scientific financial theory. The performance of disciplined quantitative investment strategies. You may sometimes hear about quantitative investment strategies and wonder whether an approach that's disciplined by mathematics and computer programs will add value. It sounds right, of course. You'd rather have a surgeon who went to medical school and learned about human anatomy and knows how to use the latest medical technology than one who doesn't. But remember that the general rule in the investment profession is totally counterintuitive. Expertise doesn't help. Professionalism doesn't help. Sophistication doesn't help. And in fact, technology in general doesn't help. That is, at least they don't help you to beat the market, if that's your goal. The use of quantitative investment strategies is no exception to that rule. One problem is that this term isn't clear. What exactly are quantitative investment strategies? Well, here's one definition, offered in a study by the consulting firm Greenwich Associates that was commissioned by the large investment management firm BlackRock. The term quantitative strategies is a general label applied to a broad and dynamic set of approaches that apply rigorous and systematic analysis to investing. Quantitative investors use multiple sources of information to design consistently applied investment processes to manage portfolios with typically greater breadth than fundamental strategies. Many quantitative managers' approaches are differentiated from so-called black box strategies by the fact that investment teams have the ability to intervene, to allocate risk dynamically if market conditions call for it, as opposed to implementing purely model-driven processes. Huh? A bunch of gobbledygook, no? But this is what you'll typically get in write-ups that describe sophisticated investment approaches. For some reason, it's assumed that if you don't understand the explanation, you'll think it's sophisticated. Some people still insist that a computer program will help them maintain some investing discipline and keep them from just following the herd. Wall Street Journal reporter Eleanor Lays squashed that notion in a 2010 article on the disappointing performance of quantitative funds, which were now trying to, guess what, become less quant and more human. Computer-driven mutual funds, chastened by a string of poor results and a wave of redemptions, are striving to bring more of a human touch to their investment decisions. These so-called quantitative funds, which rely largely on computer models to select investments, have been on the fritz for several years. A group of 65 such funds, tracked by investment research firm Morningstar Inc., lagged behind 72% of their category rivals on average in the 3 years ended August 27th. That's a pretty bad record. How come they did so poorly, considering that, or so you would think, they were each pursuing a disciplined objective strategy instead of just following the herd like silly human beings. According to Lays, it became painfully apparent in recent years that many quant funds were focusing on the same types of data to pick stocks. So as some of these portfolios began to stumble, they all suffered in unison. So, what was their response? Become more like humans. Many of the fund's managers are seeking to make their models a little more like people, writes Lays, by making them more responsive to changing circumstances. That can mean revisiting computer models more often, tweaking their components, or incorporating measures of macroeconomic risk rather than just stock-specific information. In other words, they're trying to put back that subjective human element, which the whole mission of quant funds was to take out. The performance of index funds based on specialized indexes. Another marketing pitch that has gathered steam recently is built around so-called smart beta strategies. The marketing has often been effective, causing many investors to buy into it. Those who market these strategies frequently imply that there's a mathematical truth that proves that the strategy is superior. But like many such claims in the investment field, it's merely pseudo-mathematics. There is no such truth. Let's backtrack to get to the origin of this deception. The trend toward indexing. For now, only a minority of investors invest in index funds, though the number of individual and institutional investors doing so is growing because of the overwhelming evidence that index funds do consistently better than other funds after fees. While index funds are gaining an increasingly large following, many investors may not hear the explanation of why index funds are better. They just remember hearing that index funds are good. So, some marketers have tried to jump on the bandwagon by using the word index to help market new products, even if the products aren't really like index funds and have higher fees. Before we get into this, we need to define some terms, including value stocks, cap-weighted, and fundamental indexing. Value stocks. A value stock is a stock in a company whose stock price is low compared to its book value, which is, roughly speaking, the total of the company's assets, its desks, its chairs, its buildings, its machinery, and so on, valued individually and added together. Value stocks have historically performed better than expected. Some possible reasons have been conjectured for this. One is that value stocks have risks that aren't captured well in MPT's only measure of risk, variability, which, as we pointed out before, is not a very good measure of risk. Another reason that has been advanced is that people are irrational. As the hypothesis goes, they don't understand that if the price of a stock is depressed, that means it's a good buy, not a bad buy. In any case, because of this observed tendency, a number of money managers have announced themselves value managers. That is, they prefer to buy value stocks and think they will outperform a market index that way. The results, as with any investment strategy, have been mixed. But in a way, this approach might be as good as any other investment strategy, except for the fact that managers of this strategy have less diversified portfolios and charge more than actual index funds. Cap-weighted indexes. Cap-weighted is short for capitalization-weighted. The capitalization of a stock, or of the company that issues it, is the price per share multiplied by the number of shares outstanding. In other words, it is the total market value of the company if its shares could be sold all at once at the current market price. The total market value of all stocks together is the sum of their capitalizations. Hence, the whole market is capitalization-weighted, or cap-weighted. A cap-weighted index fund mirrors the whole market. That is, it's a microcosm of the market. It will perform exactly the same as the market as a whole does. Most market indexes, like the Standard & Poor's 500, are cap-weighted. Market-weighted is another term sometimes used to mean cap-weighted. Other weightings are possible. For example, an equal-weighted index holds one share of each company, or perhaps an equal dollar amount of each company. As a result, in an equal-weighted index, small companies will be weighted about the same as large companies. Therefore, a small company will be a much larger proportion of an equal-weighted index than of a cap-weighted index. Hence, an equal-weighted index has a bias towards small companies, as compared to the market as a whole. Only a cap-weighted index mirrors the whole market. It's the only one that everyone could own at once. And a cap-weighted index adjusts automatically to keep on mirroring the market, even as stock prices change. These are the reasons why it's the type of index used for most index funds. Fundamental indexing. Someone came up with the term fundamental indexing to mean a way of automating the picking of stocks by eliminating the expert and using a simple algorithm instead. Fundamental indexing algorithmically tilts the portfolio, usually toward value stocks, because value stocks have often performed better in the past. But as those who really understand the stock market know, past performance does not predict future performance. So even though the value stock effect has been somewhat persistent as such effects go, there's no guarantee it won't disappear in the future, especially if a lot of people buy into it. The very fact that people have noticed that a particular strategy for stock picking has worked often means that it will start not to work anymore. A lot of people do know that the past good performance of value stocks is no guarantee they'll do well in the future, especially people sophisticated enough in investments to know why index funds have a big advantage over other funds. A better argument was needed to convince people that fundamental indexing is really better. That scenario gave birth to mathematical-sounding arguments claiming that any index that is not cap-weighted, even if the weightings are picked at random, will perform better than a cap-weighted index. Some of these arguments actually managed to get published in prestigious academic finance journals, even though the arguments are complete nonsense, as we shall see. The problem of pseudo-mathematics in the investment field. You may wonder how it's possible that papers published in prestigious journals and studies performed by prestigious institutions could claim to prove something mathematically that can't be true. But then you might not understand the investment industry and its academic arm. The mathematics in the finance field is not sophisticated, nor is most of it of any practical use. The mathematics used in other fields, for example aerodynamics and hydrodynamics, and many other fields of engineering and science, is far, far more sophisticated and complex. Moreover, it is used very effectively for practical applications, like making an airplane fly. Not so finance. Mathematics in financial journals is, contrary to the common lay belief, and contrary to the common belief even within the finance field, usually of extremely poor quality and often wrong. Mathematicians have finally begun to direct their attention to this problem. Recently, authors of a paper critical of the pseudo-mathematics in the investment field declared, "We would like to raise the question of whether mathematicians should continue to tolerate the proliferation of investment products that are misleadingly marketed as mathematically founded. The idea that any randomly chosen portfolio must outperform a cap-weighted market index makes no sense. Here is why. Suppose you randomly pick some stock weights for a portfolio. Call this Portfolio A. Now, consider an index fund portfolio that is much bigger than Portfolio A. We'll make the index fund big enough that the number of shares of each stock in it is greater than those in Portfolio A. If you take Portfolio A out of the index fund, let's call what's left Portfolio B. The two parts of the index fund, Portfolio A and Portfolio B, can't both outperform the index fund. If one outperforms it, the other must underperform it, because together they are the index fund. So the claim that any randomly weighted portfolio will outperform a cap-weighted market index is absurd. The Cass Business School Study. Nevertheless, The Economist magazine reported that a study by a prestigious business school, the Cass Business School of City University, London, somehow concluded that a system that randomly chose constituent weights for stocks, like chimpanzees throwing darts at share price listings, beat the market. The eyebrow-raising part of this, apart from the fact that the conclusion is impossible, is the phrase randomly chose constituent weights. There are lots of ways to randomly choose constituent weights. So, we got the study to see how they did it. The Cass study limited itself to 1,000 stocks. It constructed a cap-weighted index of those stocks and computed its performance over the time period it studied. Then, it set about defining a random choice mechanism for randomly chosen portfolios. Here's how they did it. Imagine that the 1,000 stocks were 1,000 numbered balls in an urn. They picked balls out of the urn, that is, stocks, one at a time, to create a randomly chosen portfolio. But each time they picked, they put the ball back, so it could get chosen again. They chose 1,000 shares this way. But if they chose portfolios like that again and again, and added them all together, they'd get a big portfolio with all the weightings the same. So their randomly weighted portfolios were constructed so that, in aggregate, they were an equal weighted index. In other words, their randomly generated portfolios held more dollars in small stocks than the market as a whole. It so happened that small stocks performed better than large stocks after the 1990s. That period was weighted heavily in the Cass study. In the 1990s, small stocks performed worse than large stocks. So the Cass results weren't, as they seemed to be, a general mathematical statement about the inferiority of cap-weighted indexes. They were only about how small stocks performed in the historical period they studied. But the marketers of fundamental indexing were gleeful. Their false claim that there's some sort of mathematical reason why any non-market cap-weighted index at all will outperform a cap-weighted index seemed to be validated, and in a respected and widely read publication. Investing scientifically using the 3, or 4, or 18-factor model. The idea of factor models has somehow captured much of the part of the investment world that likes to believe it engages in scientific investing. The online dictionary Investopedia.com defines factor models this way. Multi-factor models are used to construct portfolios with certain characteristics, such as risk, or to track indexes. When constructing a multi-factor model, it is difficult to decide how many and which factors to include. One example, the Fama and French model, named after finance academicians Eugene Fama and Ken French, has 3 factors: size of firms, book-to-market values, and excess return on the market. Also, models will be judged on historical numbers, which might not accurately predict future values. Fama and French's papers are exercises in running regressions. Regression analysis is by far the most frequently used and overused mathematical modeling technique in social science. Regression is often explained to students in about the 2nd year of high school. At least it was in our high school. There, it was called least squares fit. You have data points that graph something like this, figure 8a. You try drawing a straight line through them and measure its distance from each point, like this, figure 8b. With a little math, you can find the line that minimizes the sum of the squares of those distances. This gives you the so-called least squares fit, figure 8c. This is also called running a regression. The line is called the regression line. Let's see how running a regression applies to investing. Imagine, for example, that the variable on the horizontal axis is the rate of return on the whole stock market in any given month, and the vertical axis is the rate of return on a particular stock portfolio. Then the regression line is supposed to be the underlying relationship between the rate of return on the portfolio and the rate of return on the market. The slope of the line is called the portfolio's beta. The distances of the points from the line are the random portfolio's specific variations. The place where the line hits the vertical axis is the portfolio's alpha, or risk-adjusted performance. You could visualize these points in 3 dimensions instead. Imagine points in 3-dimensional space with a plane drawn through them so as to minimize the sum of the squares of the distances of the points from the plane. Then the plane would express a linear dependence on one of the variables on the other two. Those two are called factors. The same thing can be done in higher dimensions with more variables, but you can't visualize it. The Fama French studies. In the simple example in figures 8a through 8c, portfolio returns were regressed against just one variable, the return on the market as a whole. This is the Capital Asset Pricing Model, CAPM, which was William F. Sharpe's contribution to modern portfolio theory. Sharpe's model says you get a higher expected return if you take more market-related risk. That is, if you have a higher beta. In two studies in 1992 and 1993, Fama and French ran regressions of stock portfolio rates of return against not just one, but three variables: returns on the market as a whole, returns on value stocks, those with a low ratio of market price to book value, and returns on small stocks, those with low capitalizations. Their regressions concluded that historically just two factors, value stock returns and small stock returns, explained most variation in portfolio returns. This observation tended to imply that the more your portfolio varied like a value stock portfolio, or the more it was a value stock portfolio, and the more it varied like a small stock portfolio, or the more it was a small stock portfolio, the better its returns would be. It should be noted that Fama and French ended both papers with similar caveats, saying in the 1992 paper, "Our results are not economically satisfying." They continue, "What is the economic explanation for the roles of size and book-to-market equity in average returns?" In other words, they have no explanation for why they should have found these dependencies in the data when they ran their regressions. Nonetheless, though lacking a good explanation for why these results occurred, most of the finance profession concluded, though without adequate justification, as Fama and French themselves noted, that value stocks and small stocks not only outperformed the market in the past, but will do so in the future, too. Fama and French updated their work in a more recent paper, Size, Value, and Momentum in International Stock Returns, published in 2011. This paper, disappointingly, still does not attempt to explain the reasons that there should be a dependence of the returns of any stock on its degree of smallness and/or valueness. Instead, it is a continuation of the exercise of running regressions. The authors did add a factor that does not appear in their earlier papers, the momentum factor. This addition is due to the relatively recent observation, noted in Deadly Temptation number 1, that stocks have tended to perform better in the subsequent month or year if their previous month's or year's return outperformed the market. Fama and French's data indicated evidence of the momentum effect, except in Japan, as it has been found in other studies. Adding momentum as a fourth factor creates a better fit to returns in some regions, they say. The upshot of the 2011 study is a hash of conclusions and non-conclusions. Because so many countries and factors are tried, some produce what are apparently significant results, while others do not. In Fama and French's papers, the co-authors assume a scientific posture of objectivity, not even trying to interpret or explain their results. One reason, of course, would be that they can't explain them. Another is that any explanation would be sheer speculation, and therefore doesn't belong in a scientific paper. Another way of saying they don't have a good explanation. There's nothing wrong with presenting results without explaining them and leaving it to others to try to explain them. That's the idea of seminal research. If your findings provoke discussion and efforts to interpret them, eventually leading to a new and improved theory, that's great. Fama, in fact, during the writing of this book, received the Nobel Prize for a different, more important seminal paper he wrote 50 years ago on the efficient market hypothesis. Regression formulas alone, however, are not a theory. They are merely patterns perceived in data, barren of explanation and possibly accidents of randomness. Unfortunately, however, the results of these regressions are being treated as if they were a theory in and of themselves. This is not Fama and French's fault. They said they don't have an economic explanation for the results. But it's the way their results are being treated, as if they were a theory and not just the unexplained results of regressions. Lacking a theory, these results have no lasting or practical implications. Without an explanation for them, there is no reason why results mined from historical investment data can predict the future and thus identify a market-beating strategy. The Goldman 18-factor model. Nonetheless, a good sales pitch is not to be sneezed at, especially if it involves representing how sophisticated and scientific the pitch person's company is. And of course, Goldman Sachs has to be as sophisticated and scientific as any. Thus, it came as no surprise to us to hear from an insider at Goldman Sachs that they use an 18-factor model in their investment strategy. You need to know something about Goldman's investment performance. That is, the performance of their clients' investments. A 2011 article describes how badly clients have done when they invested with Goldman. A big chunk of GSAM's, Goldman Sachs Asset Management's, assets are its separate accounts, pools of money invested for institutions and wealthy individuals. eVestment Alliance LLC, an Atlanta-based research firm, tracks about $300 billion held in the accounts and finds that Goldman trailed its peers in 73.8% of the categories eVestment looked at during the 5 years ended on September 30th. Chicago-based financial publisher Morningstar Inc. tracks Goldman mutual funds and found that the 338 fund share classes it looks at trailed the average return of their respective peers in every broad category, including U.S. diversified equity, non-U.S. stock, and taxable bonds over the 3, 5, and 10-year periods ended on December 31st. It should be noted that Morningstar's finding that Goldman mutual funds trail their respective peers means that their performance is way, way behind low-cost index funds, which generally beat about 80% or more of their peers. Yet, as this article notes, the scientific sales pitch and the big financial industry brand name of Goldman still draws investors who either don't know or don't care about this poor performance record. Small stocks performance. In 1981, an academician named Rolf Bonds published an article on small stock returns over the years 1936 to 1975 in the Journal of Financial Economics. Bonds' paper showed that small stocks not only outperformed large stocks, but outperformed them on a risk-adjusted basis too. They had a positive alpha. But after Bonds studied them, the small stock effect, the small stock alpha, largely disappeared. Small stocks still often did better on the whole, but not on a risk-adjusted basis. Much later, researchers Gary Miller and Scott McKillop decided to do a quick regression on historical small stock returns. They found what other people had found, that they didn't exhibit much in the way of alpha, if any, during the years after Bonds' study. This really shouldn't be surprising. If some particular stock or group of stocks gets much more popular, often because of its past performance, people who want to buy it drive the price up. When the price of a stock is driven up, its future rate of return won't be as good as it was before its price was driven up. Miller and McKillop then decided, just for the heck of it, to run their regression on Bonds' original data. They found no alpha. They were nonplussed. Why was there no alpha when Bonds got an alpha? We can answer that because we replicated their study. They used a different kind of rate of return in their study. But it's the rate of return you should use. Rates of return can be very confusing. For example, mortgage lenders have to state a loan's annual percentage rate, APR. That rate is calculated by taking the monthly interest rate and multiplying by 12 months. The 1-month period is arbitrary. You could just as well take the weekly rate and multiply by 52, or the hourly rate and multiply by 8,760, or the secondly rate and multiply by 31,536,000. If you keep time splitting, you eventually converge to the continuously compounded rate of return, CCR. Let's call the ordinary monthly rate the holding period return, or HPR. By saying that the HPR is the ordinary monthly rate, we mean, for example, that if you start the month with $100 and don't add anything, and at the end of the month you have $101, then your HPR is 1%. By contrast, the CCR is 1.005%. The HPR and the CCR are slightly different, but there's one attribute the CCR has that the HPR doesn't have. It is symmetric. The chance that its value is minus 20% is about the same as the chance that its value is plus 20%. That's not true of the HPR. The HPR is skewed. It's significantly more likely it will be plus 20% than minus 20%. Bonds and virtually every other user of regression analysis in finance used the HPR. The researchers who backtracked his data, and we, when we replicated their work, used the CCR. Which is better? They're both rates of return. One is equivalent to the other in the sense that one can easily be converted to the other. But for regression analysis, particularly to test whether the alpha you found was significant or not, statisticians consider it better to use the number that is symmetric, the CCR. An arcane niche of mathematical statistics investigates such matters in depth, but we needn't delve into it here. It is, however, generally assumed by those who apply regressions in fields of science and engineering that if the distributions are substantially skewed, that is, not symmetric, then the results may not be dependable. Strictly speaking, the distributions should be normal, also called Gaussian, in order to apply significance test statistics, like the t-statistic. Well, it turns out that the HPR used in regressions often gives you a positive alpha when the CCR doesn't, especially when the dependent variable, small stock returns, in our case, is particularly volatile. So the more the returns on some subgroup of stocks vary, the more likely it is that using the HPR will show they have alpha. This discussion shouldn't give you a lot of confidence in the statistical results obtained by financial researchers. The mathematical methods used in their research don't satisfy the mathematician's definition of rigor. Financial researchers frequently don't define clearly what they mean by a particular variable or symbol in their mathematics, and they don't check out adequately whether the assumptions of the methods they're using are satisfied or not. They would be offended by what we're saying because they think they're being rigorous, but they're not. We could write far more about what's wrong with the use of mathematics in the investment industry and its claims to science. We haven't even covered the mathematical models that failed dismally in the financial crisis of 2007 through 2009, or many other failures of mathematical models in finance. Our bottom line recommendation remains the same. When you hear claims that sophisticated mathematics or science is being used in the investment field, tune the noise out. Summary of Deadly Temptation number 7. 1. The mathematics in the finance field is not sophisticated compared with most fields of science or technology. It is often full of holes or flat out wrong, and most of it isn't even of any practical use. 2. Investment strategies with mathematical-sounding names like quantitative strategies, smart beta, and four-factor model, like other investment strategies that are not quantitative, don't produce superior investment performance, except by chance. Epilogue. The Invisible Squeeze, by Michael Edesess and George Peacock. Since the global financial crisis, GFC, of 2007 to 2009, the world has become increasingly aware of two major problems. The first is the danger of systemic financial risk and breakdown. Due to the complexity and interconnectedness of the global financial system, a sudden domino-like series of failures seems possible at any time. The second problem is the justifiable concern over the financial industry's concentrated political influence, achieved through contributions to political candidates, the revolving door between the financial industry and government positions, easy access to office holders, and money spent for media campaigns. The simple advice that we recommend to you in Part 1 can help to mitigate these problems through an important secondary benefit that we call the invisible squeeze. In the late 18th century, economic philosopher Adam Smith coined the term invisible hand to describe how people acting in their own self-interest to maximize their gains may also benefit society, even if those people have no benevolent intent. In much the same way, when individuals and institutions, investors, seek to maximize their gains by pursuing the simple, low-cost strategy that we advocate in Part 2, we assert that society will benefit as profits are squeezed from Wall Street and the financial sector. This profit squeeze will happen invisibly and unintentionally, as investors pursue the best course to meet their own objectives. Product and price confusion, the key causes of problems. As we pointed out in the introduction, the high profits reaped in finance are the result of a unique combination of product and price confusion, enabling the industry to sell ordinary, inferior, and sometimes even worthless products at extraordinarily high prices. The proliferation of such products and services, facilitated by clever marketing, is the primary cause of investor confusion. Customers of the financial industry can and should ignore the array of complex-sounding and opaque products, services, and advice that create no value but add enormous charges. We hope we have helped you understand that in finance, in the vast majority of cases, most features add no value as compared to simple, low-cost alternatives. Avoiding these products and services will help increase transparency and reduce complexity and stanch the torrential flows of fees from customers to the financial industry. Beyond advising you to steer clear of complicated investment products and services, which can be relatively easy to spot, we also hope to have demonstrated that even mainstream investment options can have an enormous cost to your long-term financial health. Many basic mutual funds, for example, are able to charge 1% and higher annually based on an expectation of substantially outperforming a low-cost alternative, an expectation that is impossible to promise and rarely realized. These basic investment options drain your investment accounts unnecessarily, and by a greater amount than most investors even dare imagine. Widespread adoption of the investment strategy recommended in Part 1 would significantly reduce the impact of these problems. How? It's simple. The more that investors implement strategies that avoid extra costs and complexity, with its unseen risks, the less fragile the system will become and remain. And the more each person chooses effective and low-cost investment options, the more industry revenues and size will shrink, reducing its influence. Each person who follows our recommendation could reduce his or her contribution to the investment industry's revenue by as much as 75% to 90%. Investing in the Simplify Wall Street portfolio will help solve the problems of systemic risk and runaway political influence by simplifying the financial system, without making it less useful or efficient, and by reducing the huge and unproductive flow of funds from investors, large and small, to the super wealthy of finance. The rise of the finance industry super-rich, anecdotally. A guest article appeared in mid-2011 on the website of G. William Domhoff, a sociology professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, by someone whom Domhoff knew years ago, an investment manager who works with very wealthy clients and chose to remain anonymous for obvious reasons. The article was updated by the article's writer in December 2013. The writer, a very successful investment advisor, says, "I sit in an interesting chair in the financial services industry. Our clients largely fall into the top 1%, have a net worth of $5 million or above, and, if working, make over $300,000 per year. My observations on the sources of their wealth and concerns come from my professional and social activities within this group." The writer points out that the 1% are not truly wealthy, however, until they reach the top half of the 1%. Moreover, the higher we go up into the top 0.5%, the more likely it is that their wealth is in some way tied to the investment industry. Folks in the top 0.1% come from many backgrounds, but it's infrequent to meet one whose wealth wasn't acquired through direct or indirect participation in the financial and banking industries. In the 2013 update, the writer concludes, wealth and income are streaming to the very top of the system, and particularly to those who are direct or indirect beneficiaries of the financial industry. The years 2009 through 2012 saw an enormous transfer of wealth upwards to the top 1%, and particularly the top 0.1%. The writer shares other observations as well. Recently, I spoke with a younger client who retired from a major investment bank in her early 30s, net worth around $8 million. Since I knew she held a critical view of investment banking, I asked if her colleagues talked about or understood how much damage was created in the broader economy from their activities. Her answer was that no one talks about it in public, but almost all understood and were unbelievably cynical, hoping to exit the system when they became rich enough. The writer concludes, I think it's important to emphasize one of the dangers of wealth concentration: irresponsibility about the wider economic consequences of their actions by those at the top. The rise of the finance industry super-rich, empirically. Thanks to the recent work of several diligent economic researchers, a lot of empirical evidence has been gathered that shows how flows of funds from customers to the financial industry have greatly enhanced its wealth. For example, economist Thomas Philippon, an associate professor at New York University's Stern School of Business, compiled total payments by the U.S. non-financial sector to the financial sector in a paper for the National Bureau for Economic Research. Those payments came to almost 9% of the U.S. GDP in 2010, a near doubling of finance's share since 1980. The U.S. GDP in 2010 was $14.5 trillion. Hence, 9% of that, or more than $1.3 trillion, was paid by the non-financial sector to the whole U.S. financial industry in 2010. In another paper, Philippon and co-author Ariel Reshef, an assistant professor of economics at the University of Virginia, state that until 1990, workers in the financial industry earned the same compensation as workers with the same level of education in other industries. But by 2006, the average worker in finance received 50% more than those in other industries. The finance industry has not improved so much or in such a manner that it would explain or justify that significant increase. This difference was much more pronounced at the upper levels of the pay scale, say Philippon and Reshef. Workers in the top decile in finance earned 80% more than workers in the top deciles of other industries, and executives in finance earned 250% more than executives in other industries. Who receives this increased income? Evidence points to the conclusion that much of the vastly increased flows from the non-financial sector to the financial industry in the United States in the last 30 to 40 years has gone to the very top of the nation's income ladder. Economic researchers Thomas Piketty of the Paris School of Economics and Emmanuel Saez of the University of California, Berkeley, find that the share of national income accruing to upper income groups has increased sharply in recent decades, particularly in the United States. This comes mostly from the very top. The top percentile income share itself has more than doubled, from less than 10% in the 1970s to over 20% in recent years. Furthermore, Piketty and Saez say, the top 1% alone has absorbed almost 60% of aggregate U.S. income growth between 1976 and 2007. Evidence presented by three other researchers, John Bakija of Williams College, Adam Cole of the U.S. Department of Treasury, and Bradley Heim of Indiana University, narrows this down to the top 0.1% of income earners. These researchers state that The percentage of all pre-tax income, excluding capital gains, in the United States that was received by the top 0.1% of income earners rose strikingly from 2.2% to 8.0% between 1981 and 2006. We find that executives, managers, supervisors, and financial professionals account for about 60% of the top 0.1% of income earners in recent years, and can account for 70% of the increase in the share of national income going to the top 0.1% of the income distribution between 1979 and 2005. Of these, the largest portion, 18.4%, are directly employed in the financial professions. 15% are salaried non-finance executives, and 13.6% are executives of non-finance related closely held businesses. Have the increased revenues to the financial industry and finance professionals produced any benefit? Defenders of the industry argue that it has developed highly efficient systems to transfer and diversify risk and to allocate financial resources where they are needed. Yet, in his research on this question, Philippon found that the financial industry is no more efficient at its job of financial intermediation, of transferring financial resources from their sources and allocating them to their uses, than it was decades ago, when it received half as much as a share of GDP. It merely gets paid more. Of course, in any industry, most firms and most people seek to generate as much profit as possible. But when an industry doubles its share of the nation's GDP, and its average worker increases his or her pay by 50% relative to other workers in a few short years, we have to ask why that is so. We believe it is simple. The industry benefits from a series of lies, myths, and misdirections that confuse the consumer, who would otherwise be the natural check on and arbiter of market pricing. But you can change that, at least for your own investments. The spiral of increasing complexity. As we noted in the introduction, the increasing complexity of financial products and services creates a wall of impenetrable, misleading, and deceptive information. This confusion adds greatly to the cost to customers of obtaining correct and truthful information and of doing financial transactions. Furthermore, the proliferation of products, strategies, and marketing noise tends to make even the most mainstream investment options harder to evaluate because they float in an overwhelming ocean of inscrutable information. And when investors are confused, they seek ways to understand or even take advantage of the complexity. In turn, opportunistic providers of financial products and services exploit investors' quest for this elusive and tantalizing advantage by producing increasingly complex-sounding and generally costlier offerings accompanied by cleverly designed marketing pitches. This self-feeding cycle does nothing but continuously perpetuate the confusion and complexity. As we have also recently seen and experienced, this complexity does not beneficially distribute risk throughout the financial system. On the contrary, it increases global financial systemic risk. For example, in the run-up to the GFC, both investors and regulators did not, and, worse and more likely, were not able to, properly evaluate the individual and systemic risks of pooled subprime mortgages and loans known as collateralized debt obligations, CDOs, and insurance contracts known as credit default swaps, CDSs. Ratings agencies were not able to evaluate them either, or at least they had an incentive to allow their evaluations to be manipulated by their clients, the large investment banks that issued the CDOs. Neither investors nor regulators knew what was happening, but the financial industry did, or should have. When this kind of opacity builds up in the financial system, it puts the entire system at risk. The global financial crisis, still too recent and casting too long a shadow for us to forget it, showed just how risky it is. A lifeline to a solution. As we've seen, the financial industry is what some have called a rogue industry that poses dire risk to the entire global financial system. The enormous differentials between compensation in the financial industry and compensation in other industries, plus the huge size of the industry, have contributed to and solidified its economic and political power, and the widening of economic inequality. An upper echelon has emerged that is increasingly isolated from the socio-economic realities of the vast majority of citizens. Furthermore, too many talented university graduates are drawn by the high pay to an unproductive industry, talent that could otherwise contribute to society in other areas. Solutions to these problems have been sought through increasing regulation, in breaking up banks, in restoring moral values and good business ethics. But the banks have captured the regulatory system, and there has been no meaningful attempt to shrink them, and thus the risk. In fact, the largest banks are bigger than they were before the crisis. As for restoring moral values and good business ethics, we'll merely say that that doesn't fall under your control, and it's a goal that is definitely not easy to accomplish. But there is a simple, effective, and more obvious, once you think about it, solution. One that adheres to the basic laws of economics. The Simplify Wall Street SWS portfolio, introduced in Part 1. It's not only the best portfolio you can invest in for your own financial good, but the more people adopt it, the more it will squeeze from Wall Street a large portion of the profits that allow it to maintain its oligarchic hold on the regulatory process and maintain its oversized influence on the U.S. economy. Investing in the SWS portfolio need not be an explicit boycott of Wall Street or the mainstream financial industry. You should pursue the SWS for your own good, because it's the best investment strategy available. As if guided by Adam Smith's invisible hand, however, each investor pursuing his or her own best investment interest will result in the best interest of society, because these choices collectively can significantly reduce systemic financial risk and concentrated economic power. The actions of individuals acting freely can accomplish what no regulation ever could. We hope that we have cut through much of the confusion and made it clear that a very simple, least-cost option is easily available to all investors, whether individual or institutional. It will benefit you, and all of us as well.
This has been an Audible Studios production.